Central Asia, Arabia, and North Africa, the Ottoman Empire was once a great source of regional stability and security, and a beacon for the arts, science, religion, and culture. But after its peak, the former superpower struggled to sustain its bloated government and decentralized political structure. By the beginning of the 20th century, the empire that had stood for nearly 600 years was already long past its peak, and could no longer withstand defeat against the British and their allies. To help win the war, the British encouraged the Hashemites, who at the time controlled Mecca and Medina and parts of the Western Arabian Peninsula, to lead the Arab revolt against the Ottomans. Now in return, the British promised them control over a huge Arab kingdom, encompassing large parts of the Levant and Arabia, as part of a pan-Arab homeland. These promises were made during the 1915 to 1916 McMahon-Hussein correspondence between Sir Henry McMahon, the British High Commissioner in Egypt, and Sharif Hussein bin Ali, the Emir of Mecca. But by the end of the war, most of the Middle East was to be under the control of Allied powers, as per the secret 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement. This was an Allied power treaty that would betray the promises made to the Hashemites by dividing the Ottoman Empire's territories among European powers. France would control modern-day Syria and Lebanon, along with parts of Turkey, and Britain would control Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine.
The division of the Middle East during the Ottoman period. The Middle East as we know it now was one large space, a space in which towns dominated, not states, not nations. So you could go to school in Jerusalem, go to secondary school in Amman, and go to the university in Cairo. Normal for people, young Arabs being educated. That creating it into little states, dividing it between France and Britain, I think, as we can see, was not a great idea as far as the Arab people were concerned. It effectively led to the whole idea of an Arab nation, an independent Arab nation, being wrecked by all this. And divide and rule, of course, traditionally is the way imperial powers rule.
In 1917, a second betrayal to Arab nationalism struck. The Balfour Declaration was signed, in which the British government expressed support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. At the time, less than 10% of the total population were Jewish, whilst the majority, 80%, were Palestinian. This letter, which was just 112 words, would shape the region in the decades to come. The Balfour Declaration was included in the British Mandate for Palestine, which was established by the League of Nations in 1920. Post-World War I, the League of Nations set up a mandate system that granted control over former German and Ottoman territory to the European victors in the war. The mandate system was designed to prepare former Ottoman territories for self-rule, but in practice it functioned as colonial oversight. One very infamous British politician played a crucial role in shaping the region during this transitional period, particularly through his tenure as colonial secretary from 1921 to 1922. On the 9th of March 1921, the newly appointed colonial secretary, Winston Churchill, arrived in Cairo, ready to convene the conference that would take place over the course of the month in Egypt's capital and later Jerusalem. The purpose? To resolve the conflicting policies defined in the half-promises made by the British government to Arabs. These include the McMahon letters, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and the Balfour Declaration, which had all caused civil and political unrest, uncertainty in the region, and resistance against British rule. Churchill's arrival in Cairo was met with protests, particularly from student demonstrators who saw him as a symbol of British betrayal. Churchill supported the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Mandatory Palestine. Now, it's well documented that he saw European Jews as a civilizing force in a region filled with barbaric enemies, the Arabs, a force that could help secure British influence. He called Zionist settlements a blessing to the world and Great Britain. His support for Zionism and Britain's perceived failure to honour Arab independence created widespread resentment. Protests against Churchill's visit extended beyond Cairo, with demonstrations and riots erupting in Jerusalem and Jaffa. Palestinian leaders also formally submitted petitions expressing their opposition to the British mandate as they feared losing their land. During this time, waves of mostly European Jews continued to arrive into mandatory Palestine, purchasing land, establishing settlements, and reviving the Hebrew language, all with the aim of creating a national homeland. So what happened at the conference? The Cairo conference officially began on the 12th of March 1921 at the Semiramis Hotel, gathering the who's who of British colonial figures, including military and administrative officials from Palestine and Mesopotamia. It was chaired by Churchill, and notable attendees included T.E. Lawrence, known as Lawrence of Arabia, and daughter of the desert, Gertrude Bell. While a few notable Arab figures attended, their role was largely consultative, with little real influence on the outcomes. The conference aimed to define the political landscape of the region, redrawing borders and creating new states, specifically to settle the borders and governing arrangements of Iraq, Palestine, including Transjordan, or what became Jordan, and the Persian Gulf, on behalf of the British Empire. At the time, the pan-Arab nationalist movement was on the rise, and fueled by widespread dissatisfaction with the post-World War I arrangements that sought to divide Arab lands. In order to stifle the threat, Churchill decided to hastily appoint British allies. The Hashemites, who fought the Ottomans alongside the British in World War I, fitted the bill. Churchill appointed the Hashemite princes as monarchs in new states, Faisal in Iraq and Abdullah in Transjordan. These sons of Sharif Hussein of Mecca were rewarded for their wartime service against the Ottomans. Faisal and Abdullah were seen as figures who could command a degree of legitimacy among respective local Arab populations, helping to stabilise British-controlled territories while securing British oversight and interest, especially with regards to oil in Iraq. Churchill confided in Prime Minister Lloyd George that this was the best and cheapest solution, and no local interests could be allowed to get in the way. Let's take a look at some of the details and their ramifications. Transjordan was created by dividing the Palestine Mandate into two. A new state, Transjordan, became the area east of the Jordan River, whilst the area west of the Jordan River remained as the British Mandate of Palestine. Abdullah's rule in Transjordan served as a buffer against French influence from Syria and helped ensure British dominance in the region. By placing the Hashemites in power, Churchill minimised direct British military and administrative involvement, creating nominally independent states that remained dependent on British support. Whilst Churchill had placed the Hashemites as heads of state in the newly created Transjordan and Iraq, they also financed and supported a rival who was on the rise and threatened the Hashemite position in the region. Abdulaziz ibn Saud, the ruler of Najd and the founder of modern Saudi Arabia, gained more attention from Britain as he began consolidating power in Central Arabia during and after the war. Despite tensions with the Hashemite allies, Churchill approved continued payments to the Al Saud family and armed them for years. In 1924, the Hashemite-Al Saud rivalry came head-to-head after Ibn Saud's forces launched an attack on the Hijaz. Hussein was unable to mount an effective defence due to the lack of resources and was left abandoned by the British after they refused to intervene militarily in support of Hussein. By October 1924, Ibn Saud's forces captured Mecca, forcing Hussein to abdicate and flee. In Iraq, previously known as Mesopotamia, the new state was carved out of former Ottoman territories, Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra. It was essentially the unification of three distinct provinces, each with their own ethnic and cultural characteristics. Britain promoted the Hashemite prince Faisal, who was from the Hijaz in Western Arabia, to king. This was met with great disdain from local Iraqis who, despite their divisions as Kurd, Turkmen, Shia, Sunni, Christian, and Jew, were extremely independent, and so saw Faisal's appointment by Britain as a form of foreign imposition. The Iraqi crown was insecure and relied heavily on Britain for economic, government, and military support. Local and tribal leaders saw King Faisal as a British puppet, and so, Angered by Britain's refusal to grant true independence after World War I, widespread resistance to British control broke out during the 1920s. The British used overwhelming force, including air power, to suppress the revolts. They bombed villages and rural areas, killing civilians and combatants indiscriminately. Churchill saw to it that any threat to imperialist rule was dealt with by any means necessary, stating that he was strongly in favour of using poison gas against uncivilized tribes. Although Churchill's relationship with King Faisal began amiably, he started to see him as a nuisance and grew frustrated when Faisal refused to fully suppress nationalist and anti-colonial movements within Iraq, seeking instead more independence. The resistance infuriated Churchill, who saw this as disobedience and ungratefulness. Churchill would eventually be advised to agree to the Anglo-Iraqi Treaty of October 1922, giving Iraq limited self-governance while keeping its foreign affairs in the hands of the British. Churchill's decisions during Iraq's formation would cause instability in the country in the decades to come. It would lead to coups and revolts that were violently suppressed by British forces and culminated in the 1958 Nationalist Revolution that overthrew the British-aligned Hashemite monarchy. A month after the Cairo conference, on the 23rd of March, Churchill left Cairo for Jerusalem via Gaza, the first large town within the southwestern boundaries of the Palestine Mandate. The purpose of this visit was to discuss the implementation of the conference's decisions, particularly regarding the governance of Transjordan and Palestine. Despite a British ban on gatherings, the colonial leader's arrival triggered Palestinian protests in Haifa against increased Jewish immigration. The demonstrations were violently suppressed by British police, who killed a young boy and a Muslim woman. At the time, 83,000 Jews and 600,000 Arabs lived between the Mediterranean Sea and the River Jordan. Churchill met with Palestinian delegates and his newly installed leader of Transjordan, Emir Abdullah, son of Sharif Hussein. The British colonial secretary reassured Emir Abdullah that Jewish immigration would not spread to east of the River Jordan into Transjordan. But Churchill remains a firm supporter of Zionism, saying it is not in my power to repudiate the Balfour Declaration, nor my wish to do this. Churchill reported back to London that Transjordan would become an Arab kingdom, ruled by Abdullah, and that Western Palestine from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River would be ruled by Britain, with a commitment to continued Jewish immigration. In 1922, Churchill issued what is known as the Churchill White Paper to clarify Britain's policy in Palestine. The paper addresses tensions between Palestinians and Jews arising from the Balfour Declaration and emphasizes the establishment of a national home for Jews, whilst appeasing Arab leaders by limiting Jewish immigration. Churchill echoed the colonial narrative that Zionist settlements in Palestine developed a land that had been neglected and left barren before Jewish immigration, a myth that has been proven otherwise by Palestinian historians. According to historians, Churchill viewed Palestinians at the bottom of the social hierarchy he envisioned for the Middle East. He viewed them as farmers and part of rural society and therefore less significant. Now at the top were Arab Bedouins, whom he admired and believed he could negotiate with effectively. Historian Tariq Ali argued that the creation of Israel was one of the last imperial acts of an empire in serious decline, but still with sufficient colonial clout. British power was an absolute condition for Zionist colonization.
He said there are good Jews and there are bad Jews. The bad Jews make revolutions, and the good Jews are Zionists who want to build their own state, their own state.
By 1945, Prime Minister Winston Churchill had led Britain and its allies to victory over Nazi Germany, solidifying his reputation as a wartime leader. In the wake of the Holocaust, global sympathy for Jewish suffering surged, intensifying Zionist efforts to encourage Jewish migration to Palestine. In the recent years preceding this, tensions in historic Palestine had escalated dramatically. Palestinian resistance to British rule had grown widespread, fueled by a loss of jobs, land and resources in favour of Jewish settlers. The 1937 Peel Commission proposed a two-state solution, a Jewish-only state and a secular state for Palestinian Muslims, Christians and Jews. Palestinians rejected the plan of a Jewish-only state. This was followed by the 1939 White Paper, that restricted Jewish immigration and land purchases, promising eventual Palestinian independence. This policy angered Zionist groups, leading to violent reprisals against the British, including the infamous 1946 bombing of the King David Hotel by the Zionist Irgun militias, which killed 91 people, including British officials. Though the attack deeply embarrassed the British government, Churchill, no longer in power, condemned it, whilst maintaining his opposition to limits on Jewish migration. The British, reluctant to engage with Zionist militias, handed the issue back to the UN. The UN proposed a partition plan, granting a disproportionate share of land to the Jewish minority. In May 1948, Britain ended its mandate, and the State of Israel was declared, sparking the first Arab-Israeli war. Before the war even began, Zionist militias had already violently displaced 200,000 Palestinians from their land. A further 550,000 Palestinians were violently dispossessed during the war.
So, a lot of the troubles in today's world are the outcome of Churchill and imperial policies carried out by the British in that part of the world. So there's no